Chernobyl is covered by the largest movable structure ever built on land. An arch of steel, 36,000 tons of it, tall enough to swallow a cathedral, slid into place over the ruins of Reactor 4 at a cost of around €1.5 billion. It was designed to hold for 100 years. The material it was built to contain stays dangerous for 24,000. That gap is not an oversight. It is the entire point, and nobody involved has ever pretended otherwise. To understand what that arch is actually doing, you have to understand what was already there. In April 1986, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant tore itself apart. What was left was not a damaged building. It was an open wound, a shattered reactor hull venting radiation into the sky, with the melted core of the reactor still inside it. There was no plan for this because nobody had ever needed one. So the Soviet Union improvised at enormous human cost and built a box around it. They called it the object shelter. The world calls it the sarcophagus. It went up in about 200 days through the back half of 1986 in radiation fields that made ordinary construction impossible. Workers could not stay in place long enough to weld properly. Cranes were operated remotely or by men who got a matter of minutes on the machine before their exposure limit ran out and the next man climbed up. Sections were lowered against a ruined structure and left to rest wherever they landed because there was no safe way to go in and secure them. The result was a shelter that was never sealed, never fully surveyed, and never structurally sound in the way a building is supposed to be. Much of its weight leaned on the damaged remains of the reactor building itself, and the engineers who signed off on it gave it a working life measured in decades, not centuries. It was a lid slammed on a fire. It bought time. That was all it was ever meant to do. By the 2000s, that time was running out. The sarcophagus was leaking. Rainwater was getting in through gaps in the roof, running down through the wreckage, and coming back out contaminated. Steel was corroding. Engineers assessing the structure concluded there was a genuine risk of partial collapse, and a collapse would not just be a building falling down. Dropping thousands of tons of concrete onto the ruins of a reactor core would raise a cloud of radioactive dust off material that had been sitting undisturbed for a generation. And what is under there is not a scattering of debris. Something in the order of 200 tons of fuel-bearing material is still inside Reactor 4, most of it fused into masses of what is called corium, uranium fuel, melted together with sand, concrete, and steel into something like radioactive lava that cooled in place. The most famous of these formations sits in a corridor beneath the reactor. It is a dull, wrinkled slab that acquired the name the Elephant's Foot. And for years after the accident, standing beside it for a few minutes was enough to kill a person. So the world built the arch. If the scale of this is getting to you, hit subscribe. We take apart a new colossus every week. The new Safe Confinement was funded through a fund administered by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, paid into by something like 45 countries. It stands roughly 108 meters tall with a span of about 257 meters, and it was deliberately not built over the reactor. It was assembled a few hundred meters away, on clean ground, so that the people building it were not standing in the worst of the radiation. Then in November 2016, over the course of several days, it was pushed along rails into position across the ruin. 36,000 tons of steel slid horizontally and set down over a destroyed reactor with a tolerance measured in centimeters. It was formally handed over in 2019. Every part of that design says the same thing. The arch is sealed to keep dust from getting out and weather from getting in. It has an internal climate system to hold humidity low, because dry steel corrodes slowly and wet steel does not. And critically, it carries an overhead crane system, remotely operated, running the length of the structure. That crane is not there for maintenance. It is there so that machines can eventually go in and take the old sarcophagus apart from the inside, piece by piece, without a single human being standing under it. That is what the 100 years actually is. It is not a promise that the problem ends in a century. It is a working window, an enclosed, controlled, dry environment in which robots can dismantle the 1986 shelter and begin the far harder job of getting the fuel out. The arch does not solve Chernobyl. It creates the conditions under which somebody eventually might. And the 24,000 years is not rhetoric either. Plutonium-239, which is present in that fuel, has a half-life of a little over 24,000 years. Half-life means half. After 24,000 years, half of it is still there, still doing what it does. There is no engineering, no material, no institution on the planet with a 100-year service life that meaningfully addresses a number like that. The best available answer was to build the strongest box anyone could build and hand the problem forward. And the arch was never meant to be the end of it. The plan written into the project was that the new Safe Confinement would buy a working space, dry and stable, in which remote cranes mounted inside the roof would finally take the old sarcophagus apart and lift the corium out. That second half has barely begun. The cranes exist. The funding, the technology for handling 200 tons of radioactive lava, and the place to put it afterward do not, which assumes the century actually gets to run. In February 2025, a drone struck the arch and punched through its outer skin, starting a fire that burned and smoldered inside the structure's layered cladding and took days to fully extinguish. The containment envelope, the sealed barrier that was the entire justification for 1.5 billion euros of steel, was compromised in a single night by a weapon that costs a rounding error of that. Radiation levels outside did not spike, and the structure did not fail. But the assessments that followed were unambiguous. The sealed environment that the whole 100-year plan depends on had been broken, and repairing it is neither quick nor cheap. That is the part nobody mentions about Chernobyl's arch. Its function is containment, not cure. The safest thing humanity managed with Reactor 4 was to build a magnificent shelter over it, keep it dry, and hand the responsibility to people who have not been born yet. The clock started in 2016. It has already been interrupted once. Next time, the largest machine ever built to move a river